Hi, friends, and welcome to the Harbor Breeze Home Podcast. I'm your host, Rita Joy, and if you're popping in here today for the first time, welcome here. This is part 2 of a mini-series called Anchored in Hope, Meaningful Living in Later Years, a 4-part teaching series each Friday by my husband, Irwin. I was just remembering back to a scene that happened almost 6 years ago. We were sitting at the office of a seminary student advisor discussing the options available for Irwin to pursue a master's degree in Chaplaincy and Spiritual Care. In some ways, it feels like that happened just yesterday, and in other ways, a lifetime ago. Irwin had spent quite a bit of time doing training with our local hospice organization and found he really enjoyed his time working as a volunteer there. They had asked him to be the volunteer chaplain, and in the course of conversations regarding that, gave him the idea of getting further training in that field. The idea grew in his mind until it led us to that office that day. The kind young man explained how the process could look and his recommendations for someone who was pursuing studies while working full-time, and mapped out a plan with Irwin's, shall we say, older age? He was 53 then, taken into consideration. The man advised that the courses should be taken slowly and methodically so it could be done alongside of the load of working at the same time. So that's what he's been doing. We found a rhythm that seemed to work quite well. He'd take his courses usually starting in January and September with a much-needed break in the summer. After his days at work, he'd head up to the office after dinner and watch online classes, write, or read. And then, after he'd finished an assignment, we had a tradition that played out every time. He'd come down the stairs with an exuberant, "It's all finished," and I'd head up to the office for the final reading. That's what we called it. He liked me to read his papers out loud for him to listen to so he could proofread his sentence structure, grammar, and punctuation through someone else's reading. I always found it fascinating to read those papers that he'd spent months researching, pondering, and writing about. It wasn't my normal reading material, honestly, but it felt really special to have the privilege of learning these new things. So now this podcast series is similar to that. The topic of loneliness is something he's been observing, studying, and we've been talking about off and on for literally years now. As his focus of study is on older and aging adults, I find so much of it applicable and thought-provoking for my own life. For instance, as I pondered the topics of loneliness and solitude that was described in part 1, I realized that the loneliest years of my life were years where I was almost constantly surrounded by people. And now I spend most of my days alone, and I'm happier than a clam. However, the things that we've been talking about has made me realize I need to be very purposeful in creating and building things into my life now to help combat loneliness in the future. Today's topic is a really big one, but it's important. Talking about end-of-life issues isn't normal coffee shop talk, but it's part of life that we all will need to face someday. In this episode, he talks about a little bit about my mom's story with dementia. If you want to hear more about that, I talk about it in the episode titled, "The Life Lesson My Mom's Dementia Taught Me." We'll link it in the show notes. Thanks so much for being here, friends. I'll pass this mic over to Irwin now.
Thank you, Rita. Welcome back to the Loneliness Project, a podcast dedicated to overcoming loneliness as we enter our later years. This is part 2, which I have titled End of Life and Loneliness, Hard Truths and Real Hope. My name is Irwin, and as Rita mentioned, I'm doing this project to complete my master's degree in Chaplaincy and Spiritual Care. I appreciate those who listened to my first episode so much. I do have a short questionnaire that I sent to the mailing list. If you're not on that list, you can join the list in the show notes of these episodes, or send me a message on social media and I can get the questions your way. I will be sending a Starbucks card to a couple of randomly chosen responders. I'd love some feedback or questions. I'll respond to some of this feedback in part 4. My contact information is always in the show notes, or if you're on my email list, you can reply that way. Before I launch into the material for this episode, let's think back to the last one. We discussed some definitions of social isolation, loneliness, and solitude. We also covered why it is so important to address the loneliness crisis among older adults. Where did you see yourself on the continuum between loneliness and solitude? If you haven't listened to that one yet, I would encourage you to go back and listen. How do you see yourself when you spend time alone? Are you able to enjoy the time, or do you simply long for companionship? Do you feel more lonely when all alone, or when you're with certain kinds of people? How do you move from loneliness to enjoying solitude, or, at the very least, enduring it? Can you? Can you build your resilience? I know these are not easy questions, and there is no simple answer. I'm not an expert, but I do have some ideas, and I will share some very practical ideas that I have uncovered in Part 3. In Part 4, we will talk about theological hope. I really believe that there is hope because of Jesus Christ. Today, I will discuss some of the issues around loneliness that are encountered near the end of life. Now, I realize that this is not the sort of topic one would discuss around the table at dinner, but I do think it is important to have some awareness of these issues that we face near the end of our lives. As you will see, some of the decisions one makes in their midlife can influence how one thrives in later years. The information I give is from course study, my research, and from personal observations and conversations with older adults inside and outside of care homes. I have 3 related topics to cover: a brief discussion on loneliness and medical assistance in dying, loneliness and dementia, and loneliness and spiritual distress at the end of life. The first topic is one that most of us are quite uncomfortable with, but since we'll all sooner or later run into this, I need to spend just a minute or two here. The requests and instances of medical assistance in dying, or MAID for short, have been an increasing concern since MAID was legalized just a few years ago in Canada. The reasons people give for requesting MAID are numerous. In my reading and in the conversations I've had, the reasons given are complicated, including unbearable pain, not wanting to be a bother, or even wanting ultimate control. However, loneliness is also a factor in the request for MAID. Not always directly, but indirectly sometimes, since emotional loneliness appears to be a strong cause of emotional pain, and of the experience of emotional pain as being hopeless and unbearable. The Christian response to this must be sensitive, even if we have very strong convictions, and I do. However, as a representative of Jesus Christ, I must be gentle and caring in my responses. In those moments when we think we are totally helpless and alone, we have Jesus beside us, ready to give meaning to the suffering. This will help us find and give purpose to what is otherwise such a meaningless and hopeless situation. We may not be able to change someone's mind regarding medical assistance in dying, but we can be a loving presence with them in the midst of whatever they are going through. For much of this second section, I am especially indebted to the work of John Swinton and his excellent book, Dementia, Living in the Memories of God. For anyone who works with someone who is struggling with dementia, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Swinton notes that the loneliness is a central experience for many people with dementia. He quotes a study that indicated that people who are lonely are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. This is confirmed in other studies I've read. More sobering still is that they have found that being lonely at younger ages was associated with increased mortality and morbidity in later life. In other words, not only is the chance of dying higher if you're lonely in midlife, but your chance of living a healthy, full life is diminished as well. Another article I read states, our study suggested that exposure to loneliness below the age of 70 years increases the risk of dementia compared to those aged 70 and above. As mentioned in the first episode, our perceptions make all the difference. It is the individual's perception of being lonely rather than their actual degree of social isolation that seems to correlate most closely with their Alzheimer's risk. Lonely adults are also more likely to engage in health-compromising behaviors, such as heavy alcohol intake, smoking, and lack of physical activity. Okay, wow, I think we need to pause for a moment. This is all pretty heavy and sobering. Let's stop and remember why we are doing this. I mentioned in the last episode that this podcast is for those who are middle-aged or older adults who are either facing aging themselves or looking after and trying to understand aging parents or relatives. So this information is for you as an individual and as a caregiver. As an individual, understanding this is important in order to mitigate against the long-term effects of loneliness. As a caregiver, it may help you understand others just a little better. I have a little story about my wife, Rita. This may seem like a rabbit trail, but I assure you that I have a point and that the same principle is at work. Many years ago, when we were in our late 20s, Rita and I were discussing some of the people we saw around us in the communities we were involved in. She'd been involved in a women's group that spanned the age range from young moms to grandmothers. There were some of the sweetest people present, but there were also some, let's just say others. As Rita reflected on the people she was meeting, she asked me one day, almost in a panic, "Does it always happen when we get older? Will I grow to become a grouchy old lady? Do I have to?" I'm not sure what made me say it, but my half-joking response as a young husband was, "Well, if you don't want to become a grouchy old lady, make sure you're not a grouchy young one." It turns out that those words were wiser than I knew, and we have discussed and pondered that ever since. Rita told me recently that was a pivotal moment in her life, as she realized that what she focused on now will affect her behavior in the future. The point I'm making is that the person we become as an older adult has a lot to do with how we are as a younger adult. This has now been proven by science. The research backs me up. Before I move on from dementia, let me repeat John Swinton. Loneliness is a central experience for many people with dementia. Not only is loneliness a leading cause, but it is also a major part of living with dementia. I've witnessed this myself as I visit people in care homes in my own town. As their age increases, their social networks shrink. If they have dementia, it is increasingly difficult for them to engage with others around them. The response to this must be a systemic one and a personal one. My focus is not on the systemic side, as important as I know that is. There are some fine examples of care homes and others that have put much thought into their dementia care. I applaud this. But for you and me, here and now, I believe strongly that the personal solution has to do with taking the time. Taking the time to visit people who are struggling with dementia. As those of us who are aging begin to look at our own future of potential social isolation, our response should be to follow Jesus' golden rule. Treat others as you would want them to treat you. This may mean taking the time to join a local church's care home ministry, or seeking out someone with dementia and spending time with them on a regular basis. Maybe you could volunteer in a care home, or just spend time with that elderly neighbor that everyone says is slipping. Every hour that a lonely person with dementia spends with someone who cares is one less hour to be lonely. You cannot help every lonely person, but you can help one or two, or a few. Andy Stanley always likes to say, "Do for the one what you wish you could do for everyone." It's important to remember that a person with dementia is still a person. This should go without saying, but have you noticed how people talk about someone with dementia? They will often ask, "Does he or she still know your name?" If the answer is no, then it is almost as if that person ceases to be a person. Is this true? Well, of course not. Again, referring back to Swinton, his book title says it all. Dementia, Living in the Memories of God. Even when we forget everyone around us, and even forget who God is, He never forgets us. I wish you could have met my mother-in-law. She was a farm wife from a small county in Montana. She loved the church and she loved Jesus. She played piano and loved to sing. She also loved to laugh, and she had a very explosive and very, very loud laugh. My father-in-law always said that if he lost her in a department store, he would just stand still and listen. Pretty soon he'd hear the laugh and know where to go. Well, he died far too soon, and it was pretty hard for her for a few years. And then she remarried. Well, let's just say that didn't go well, and before long she was back home and in care. She had the kind of dementia that soon took her ability to speak. So no, we were not sure if she recognized us or not. We live a long way from the rest of the family, so we could only visit about once per year. I can still remember the day we went to meet her for the first time after she had stopped talking. It was so hard, but we tried to keep up the one-way conversation. Finally, we guided her over to the piano and began to sing together. As we began to sing our way through those familiar hymns, lo and behold, she started to sing. It was like going back in time and hearing her sing in that little small-town church. She knew the words by heart, and she sang with enthusiasm. We have since heard that music is one of the last things you lose, but to us, it was like a personal miracle straight from God. The end of one's life can often be a time of existential distress, especially if one is aware of the nearness of death and has not yet come to terms with death in a spiritual sense. It is only natural for someone as they age to become more interested in their spiritual life. When a person is nearer to death, the acute awareness of mortality can spur older adults to examine the meaning of life, which can lead to spiritual growth or spiritual distress. Spiritual distress can be described as a deep sense of hurt from being separated from God, a sense of personal inadequacy before God and man, and a pervasive condition of loneliness of the spirit. The difference between one who experiences this as a time of spiritual distress or spiritual growth is hope. When hope is absent, spiritual distress and loneliness will be the result. As adults look ahead to this time of life, it's important to think about how they want to be treated, how in turn they can reach out to others in their present time of life. Spiritual preparation is very important as well. A personal relationship now with the God who made us will make all the difference as one nears the end of one's life. This is the hope that we carry with us as we interact with others. I wrote the following in a paper a few years ago. What is the goal then in end-of-life care? Perhaps it is to be more honest, that death is not an easy process to manage or overcome. In the messiness, pain, confusion, and fear, we can realize that the God of creation, in the form of Jesus, is walking along with us and can identify with us in a way that only He can. We can still be agents of hope, but our assumptions are not merely in the hope of healing or restitution, but rather in the presence of Jesus, whether there is healing or dying. I will say more about that hope in part 4. Well, that's all I have for you today. I realize that was a pretty tough ride. Thank you for hanging in there with me. I promise that the next episode will be a little lighter and more hopeful. This is Irwin, Mr. Harbor Breeze, signing off. Blessings, my friends.